Of course, we are talking about Amy Winehouse today because we are here sitting on the eve of the anniversary of her death. It's been 10 years since the news hit that Amy Winehouse had died. And I was speaking to Mark Savage earlier on in the show, and I remember where I was when it happened. I remember hearing the news and thinking, oh my God. And I am going to get a whole list of the 27 Club, but I will do that shortly. But I want to introduce you to my next guest now. And a woman who's so pertinent to be on the show right now because she is someone who definitely, absolutely misses Amy Winehouse. In fact, she's written an entire show titled I Miss Amy Winehouse. She is the stand-up comedian, writer, a phenomenally talented journalist joining us on the show right now. It's Suchandrika Chakrabarti. Welcome to the show.
Oh, what an intro. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here on the eve of the anniversary of Amy Winehouse's death. I've never heard of anyone who's written a play called I Miss Amy Winehouse. And so when I saw it, I thought, that is brilliant. I absolutely have to talk about it. And what a day to talk about it. Firstly, though, before we even get into that, how have you been and how have you survived lockdown?
Yeah, I've been okay. And I survived lockdown by... I got into comedy, weirdly. It was not a great time for live comedy, but I did like Zoom gigs and sort of, writing things like the show I sort of wrote in May, and I booked myself slots at the Brighton Fringe in Camden and was like, well, I've got to do it now.
Well, absolutely. Now you've booked it. It has to be done. So basically, Suchandrika, are you telling me that your first foray into comedy was during lockdown?
So I did a comedy course in January 2020. Please don't take that as my comedy timing being that bad, because that is terrible. And then it was like 6 weeks, and then by March we do an end of course show. It's at the Bill Murray in Islington, which is a brilliant comedy club. And then it was like, oh, I did a show. I really love this. Oh no, the pandemic is definitely here. And and then for people who are professional comedians making an income from this industry, it's absolutely terrible for them. And I feel for them. And I think moving to Zoom and adapting everything for Zoom was tough, but very interesting. And I suppose if someone new, I was like, well, I'll take any sort of stage/screen time I can, and let's just start writing the material and see what we can do. But it was tough because a lot of like good material, I think, is similar to good journalism. It's like what are people talking about?
Yeah.
Like, what's the zeitgeist? What's the conversation about? And you can't do that. You can't just meet up with friends for coffee or like, two friends are chatting on the side of the table. What are you chatting about? Like, oh, great, that's a big theme. So I think we were really missing that kind of thing, weren't we?
It's a lot of scrolling through Twitter instead, isn't it?
Oof, doom scrolling, apparently.
Or Clubhouse, dropping into different conversations.
Remember Clubhouse? What happened to that?
Remember Clubhouse, indeed. And do you remember House Party from the beginning of the pandemic?
Yes, yeah.
So basically, Suchandrika, you were supposed to go into cybersecurity during this time, not go into the arts and go into comedy. You've done it the opposite way.
Yeah.
But do you know what? It's absolutely arcane, and I'm so glad that you did. Please tell me, why did you decide to write an entire show called I Miss Amy Winehouse?
I know, right? What I was doing during lockdown is, for a long time, I've been wanting to write a novel, as many journalists do, and in fact, as you have done, I saw on your Twitter. So, tell me the secret. Congratulations.
I wasn't going to bake bread. I was just going to write.
Exactly, yeah, no, I'm terrible at baking, so there's only the other option. And for me, like, I'm the same age as Amy Winehouse, so I'm about 6 months older than her. And I think when I first became aware of her in 2006 with Rehab, I think when you have someone in the public eye, he's the same age as you, and you are that young, and you've not really started on your career in that way, you're like, oh, this is fascinating. And she somehow at the same time both a superstar, but like, she felt like someone I could have gone to school with, and your mum would ring up and be like, oh, do you know what Amy's doing now? She's a giant star. Have you seen her?
Yeah.
I said both those qualities. You felt like you knew her, but obviously I never met her. And so I was trying to work on a novel, and I was really interested in looking back at sort of the turn of the century, like the noughties. I think having the internet permeate our lives and be on our phones has changed so much.
Yeah.
I heard you speaking to Mark Savage earlier, and I think the documentary sounds fascinating. So I do think journalism has changed, partly because of the internet and partly because people can push back on content they're not happy with, on headlines they don't think are right, on the way mental health is portrayed and women are portrayed. And so it was a really different time, but it doesn't feel that long ago. Although I guess it is 20 years ago, the noughties, and then which is horrifying.
It is horrifying.
The 90s was the last decade. But I was thinking about, how Amy was treated. And back then, so I worked in Camden and I partied in Camden a lot. And this is back in the age of late licenses and you could stay out.
Yeah.
And we had a joke with me and my friends that we would run into her. Like, I used to work literally inside Camden Market. The Hawley Arms is outside. Never met her. I used to go to these places. My friends would be like, "Oh, we'll meet her, and you two will hit it off. We'll be best friends." And the joke, like, we never did. She always felt like 3 steps away.
Did you ever go to a gig of hers or a performance?
Yeah, I went to Hammersmith Apollo in late 2008. So, she wasn't well, and I think there is that side of it which is very tough because I try to not in the show comment on things I can't possibly know about, which is what went on in her mind, what goes on in her private life and her family, like how they feel, because only they can know that. But I'm really interested in the persona of her because there was something that felt really nearby about her. She felt very accessible. Adele, I think for a long time felt like that kind of star as well, like a proper Londoner.
Yeah.
You could see her walking around the streets. And that is such an interesting idea because when Amy died, it was an absolute shock, and it was so heartbreaking because it felt like she was getting well and she was working on new stuff. I was working in news, and I was about to go down and get vox pops from those mourners who had really covered the grassy area outside of that.
Yeah.
And so I went down, and it was like a festival. Wow. It was like really young people, and they stayed there for quite a long time, and they were drinking and smoking, and there was a lot of eyeliner. And on the one hand, you're like, this is kind of a tribute. I get it. It's kind of nice, but it's also exactly not what you should, like, what is it? What do you get when you grieve communally? And I suppose I'm wondering, like, it's too early to talk about the fallout from the pandemic, but at some point there will be that reckoning of how do we all grieve together? And I don't have an answer. I don't know, but it felt to me that I really wanted to look at what that meant. Like, when we come together and grieve, do we come away feeling better? Do we come away stronger?
What I thought was so interesting, and when you wrote a bit about the show, is that you said that this was about the grief and that collective grief and the absurdity of grief, and also what it was like to witness the end of an era. And with that comes a grief as well, doesn't it? Of a time, of a period, of a very specific, time in your life that you're never going to be able to access again or get back.
Yeah, and I do think, when she died, like 27 is incredibly young, and most people are not thinking about the mortality then. But you think, oh God, if someone my age can just die, and you think you should be insulated by fame and presumably wealth and so on. And when someone isn't, you just go, oh, okay, wow, anything can happen. And also, from that sort of period, 2011 on, is when these sort of late licenses, when I think you lose your appetite for that kind of partying, maybe from like 27, 30 onwards. And I wouldn't want to go back there, but it was nice to think about those times, and particularly again in the pandemic, like we've been talking about in the news about like nightclubs and when people can go back. And again, for my demographic, I'm okay. I want to be in bed. But I remember that feeling. Like if I'd been in the pandemic age 27, I would have been like so keen to get back out while still understanding why we need to be in. But
absolutely. And, we were talking about it on the show last night. We had Alex Proud on, who's the founder of Proud Cabaret. And we were talking, and he exactly spoke in the same way that you have about Camden in its heyday, and those late night licenses, those grubby food trucks outside clubs, everyone being everywhere. And he mentioned Amy Winehouse and her playing a gig in one of his venues, and just that feeling of everyone always being out on the scene, and this vibrancy and these really long late nights in London as everyone was there in Camden partying and the music scene was popping. But that really has gone now, which is not to say that Camden doesn't have a vibrancy in a different way, but we don't have that nightlife kind of attitude anymore. And I said this to him, I wonder if, the golden age of nightclubs and that nightlife that you speak about is just over.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because I think when you have the need for more housing, which we do, naturally nobody can live on top of a nightclub or on top of an all night bar or anything like that. You can't expect people to, and so you're going to get the situation where people can say, "Hey, I can't deal with this noise anymore." And so we had this sort of thing with that particular Labour government that wanted to give out sort of more late licences, and then this sort of sharp turn of people saying, "Well, now I live on top of this bar, I can't cope with it."
Yeah.
So I think, like bars don't want to get in trouble, and it felt like an end of an era for us who were that age, who were in our 20s back then. And these days, I say there's less of a hard drinking, like alcohol culture among people in their 20s, which is probably much better.
They're all going to yoga classes instead.
I mean, is that not healthier, I suppose? And,
I hate yoga.
Do you? Like all forms, is it? What is it about yoga?
Absolutely hate it. And I'm not a drinker. I've never drank in my life. So this is not me advocating for boozy nights out. I am 100% going to be on the sofa with a cup of tea and a packet of biscuits or a whole cake. But yoga it's just not for me. And I realise there is a trend for I say younger millennials. I don't consider myself one of them, but there is a trend of wellness and yoga. I'm still on the sofa with a Morley's or a Dixie Chicken.
Oh, classic. I think it's a tough one as well, because I do really feel for people who are sort of like, in their 20s now, who's maybe sort of getting on for 10 years younger than me. When they went to university, they had to pay, up to 27,000. They're paying so much money, and that's just fees. Everything for them has been that, like, oh, great, something new has come in for you that makes it tougher.
Yeah.
They tend to have the side hustles. They've had the 2008 crash. The pandemic has hit them really hard. I really feel for them. If they had the time to have the hangovers, I would want them to have that nightlife. But if the pressures of living in London and the expense of living in London means they're actually working on the side, I guess that's what they need to do. It's not ideal. It's not great.
Yeah. So the show, tell me a little bit about it, because it's comedy, it's funny, it's poignant. What can people expect from it?
Yeah, so it's kind of looking back at that time in my life when, as I said, my friends were like, we're going to run into Amy, and we didn't. So because it's my show and I get to do what I want, we will get to run into Amy. We do some time traveling, we go back in time, we get to the Hawley Arms, and she will be there, and then I won't spoil anymore. But I will say also at that time, like, just before then, I had quite a lot of family bereavement myself. And so what I found fascinating about Amy is obviously her talent, that voice. I mean, I'd love to be able to sing, and I cannot. So it just is amazing to me. But, like, she would take her pain. She would have boy troubles, but essentially it was about love, which we all understand in its different forms. And she could take that, and I remember listening to Mark Ronson talking about Back to Black recently, when I was researching the show, and he said she wrote the single Back to Black in about 2 or 3 hours, which is incredible for a song that to me is timeless. Like, it's probably a perfect song. And I just sort of looked at someone who's going through so much, and so in such a raw way, and so living her life with her wounds open in front of everyone, and she can make this art, and I just thought, that's incredible. I'd love to be able to do something that I'm going through. And so in that sense, I get to go back and, like, reassess what I was doing at that time, because in our 20s, we're still so young and we're not emotionally mature yet, and now I have a very different perspective on it. So I kind of look at the past through the lens of a relationship. I say to Amy Winehouse, to obviously an idea of her, because I never really met her, sadly.
You make a good point as well about in our 20s, and we thought we were adults, but I look back at me in my 20s and I think you're an idiot. You actually knew nothing. You really did not know anything, but there is that perception of adulthood, and you've made it there, but actually still being quite a foolish person. Where is it at? Where can people see it? How can they see it? How do they get tickets? What's the situation?
So the next performance is tomorrow night. So it's at the Golden Goose Theatre in Camberwell. And if you go to their website, you can buy tickets. It's part of a double bill with Ellipsis by Isabel Farah, which also explores grief and comedy and sort of the absurdity of. So that's tomorrow night. I'll have to catch up on Mark's documentary on iPlayer later, because I really want to watch that. And then also I'm taking the show to the Camden Fringe, because that is the home of Amy. It has to be done. So it's on at the Etc. Theatre, which is above the Oxford Arms. It's on Camden High Street. I used to be around that area so much back in the day. It's around the corner from Hawley Arms, in case anyone's going to be there. And it's 9:30 p.m. on the 13th and 14th of August, and 11:30 a.m. on Sunday the 29th of August. Again, if you look at the Camden Fringe website, you'll find tickets for a £5. Please do come along. Lots of fans came along to the Brighton Fringe performances, and I think people want a space to talk about her. I think we're not done processing. Like, the 10 years have gone, but we're still reassessing what happened with her. So,
are you going to send an invite to the play to Mitch and Janice, her mum and dad?
I mean, if they want to come, yeah. I don't say anything about them in it. It wouldn't be my place to. So if they'd like to, I mean, they'd be really welcome.
Would they approve of the show?
I think so, because I make it clear that I don't know the real Amy Winehouse, and I never could, and that's part of, like, the interest for me. But, like, I'm a fan. Everything about it is positive. You mentioned the unkind headlines earlier with Mark, and I just remember her being hilarious, very biting, very quick-witted, and I love that about her. So if anything, I make the case that she might be funnier than me as a comedian, and I've got some work to do. I want to live up to it. I want to be proud. So, yeah.
If you did meet her, if you had have met her, it would have been a phenomenal double act. Suchandrika Chakrabarti.
Get my hair done.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, Suchandrika. It's been such a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
I am, of course, going to end this with an Amy Winehouse track, and it is one of my favourite